Appreciate, as was echoed before, everybody's joining the conference today. Our discussion today is really on how do we enhance the employee experience by being able to measure and monitor those elements that influence employee experience. And you won't be surprised, but it all starts with the data. You've heard the mantra, what gets measured gets changed. We also believe that what gets measured gets funded, right? So in order to change, you have to be able to justify the change, and you have to be able to fund it through your business initiatives. And this is where measurement, reporting, and analytics all brings this to life. So let's jump right in. The data itself is really that language that's going to provide the foundation for decision making. And the data, when done right, provides the insights and the clarity that you're looking for. But the question is, where do you begin? Where do you start, right? So let's talk about some of the points that we want to focus on today, and then we'll get to that starting point. All right. So we're going to talk about the data sources, right, that manage all of those various data points, and some of the best practices for extracting that data, transforming and cleaning that data and organizing it, time stamping it so we can look at things over time and drive trends, and then ultimately the best practices for developing those metrics and insights that are going to give you the answers to the questions that you're asking. But it goes then beyond the data, right? Because you have to put those elements, those metrics, those insights in the hands of your business users. And there's a few elegant ways to do that. And we'll discuss those ways so that ultimately you can use them to enhance the employee experience. So moving right along, right? Where do we start? Well, it really starts with understanding the questions that you're trying to answer. And as we frame this in the context of employee experience, we saw from some of our previous presenters, you won't be surprised that you're going to ask questions about turnover. You're going to ask questions about absenteeism, about engagement, about the onboarding experience, about all of these factors that influence the employee and how they feel about the organization, the work they do, and their willingness to contribute to make the organization excel. So you've got to frame it in terms of the questions. And then you've got to think about what data sources are needed to provide that information. And as you all know, you have quite a few sources within your HR ecosystem. Some of your data might be in your core HR system, which might be up in the cloud. It might be on premise. You may have a separate applicant tracking system. You may have a performance system, a talent system, payroll. There's lots of different maybe vendors in the mix, and you've really got to determine the accessibility and the feasibility of those sources. So how do we get that? How do we get to the people data, right? Well, there's a couple techniques I want to talk about and some best practices. But before we do that, I thought it would be advantageous to take a quick poll of the participants. And the poll itself is, how many different data sources do you have in your HR ecosystem where you would envision having to pull data from in order to measure the employee experience, and even to measure just general HR related activities. So, is it, one core system? Is it 2 to 3, your core HR, performance and training? Or do you have to lay in your benefits, your compensation, time tracking? So let's, if you would respond to the poll in the right-hand side. Okay, looks like we're getting some results here. So Nobody has just one, interestingly enough, and I'm not surprised. And many people have 10 or more. So this is a good representation. So you're feeling the struggles, right? Because there are challenges that exist with getting the data out routinely and then turning it into the information that's going to help answer your questions. So let's go ahead and switch from the poll, and thank you all for responding. Very, very enlightening. So when we look at identifying those relevant sources of data, we're going to look internally first. And so we have to look at that HR ecosystem, which is, kind of huddled around core HR, right? And within core HR, we have all the transactions that are taking place. We have, the hires, the onboarding, all of the status changes, the org changes, the job changes, all happens in your core HR system. Many of you have separate talent systems, separate performance, separate payroll, compensation, timekeeping. So, internally, that core HR ecosystem runs pretty deep. But then it begins to expand out, where, you think about performance is how things are done, how things get done. Productivity is what gets done, right? So this is information such as your sales, your distributions, your manufacturing. And then there's operational and finance data that may be important overall. So, looking at profit and loss, looking at safety, quality. And then you can turn the focus on external data, because there's external data sets that affect the employee experience. And these could be compensation benchmarking, right? Looking at sources such as salary.com. The unemployment labor market overall might affect the employee experience, particularly if there's, robust competitors within your same region that are pulling from the same pool as you. Health and community factors, we just experienced this over the last couple of years with COVID, and overall economic factors as well drive the employee experience. So it's really a mix of both internal and external. And, the opportunity is to bring all this together and put a lens over it, but it's also the challenge as well. So what are some of the best practices that we can leverage, we can put into play? Many of the newer vendors, fortunately, have provided some really robust interfaces to their data. And these are these are vendors like Workday, like UKG. They've exposed the data in a way that's fairly accessible through what we call APIs, which is an application program interface. And there's different techniques, web services. There's a concept called REST that's used to return data in a series of common formats. That might be, you've probably heard of things like ASCII, which is visual text that you can actually read. It's not encoded, but different file formats, comma separated, fixed length, XML or JSON. Many of these formats will do. Ideally, CSV or fixed lengths are some of the easier ones to work with. And then you've got to think about the data typing and the formatting itself. You want dates formatted as dates, right? You don't want them formatted as something that you can't search or filter on. Your strings have to be properly qualified in these data sets that are extracted, particularly if those strings contain, special characters. And, all of these factors are really important, because the alternative of not managing these upfront as you're extracting your data is complexity, and complexity comes at a cost. So there are tools and vendors out there with processes that do this type routinely, if not exclusively. If you're fortunate to be on some of the newer systems, or perhaps your IT organization has a series of tools that they've invested in, you'll be able to leverage those. But of course, you'll need the skill set, the knowledge to be able to do that as well. And you have to be able to obtain that access. And HR and HRIT, that bridge to the broader IT organization, typically controls that and can help enable it. So a few more best practices to think about as we're extracting that data is what we call timing and periodicity. So think about, how often do you need to extract data from each and every one of those systems? Is it on a monthly basis? Is it on a weekly basis? Is it daily? Things change daily, obviously. For large organizations with very dynamic workforces like retail and healthcare, these organizations need to really think about providing, getting access at a point of time. And then, of course, because we have these different sources of data, we have to be able to unify them or join them together. So, how are we going to do that? If we're looking at the applicant tracking data and the core HR data, the applicant tracking data isn't going to have the employee identifier that core HR has. So, what do you have? Do you have their SSN? We don't, typically want to use that, but if that's all you have, how can you use that securely in a way that can join, data together? Do you need historical data, or do you just need it currently? How far back do you need to go in order to really, drive the trends and insights and answer the questions so that you can see what's changing and, more importantly, why it's changing? And then, do you want this to be hands off, or do you want it to be, a manual thing that you have to do, at every, during every period? So there's again, tools and technologies that can help, chain a series of these workflow steps together to extract, transform, and load, and store that data so that you can have it for access and analysis. And we'll talk about those steps as well. So I'd like to kind of paint this picture of a data pipeline. This happens to be the ZeroedIn's data pipeline that we manage for clients, but it really depicts what many of you might be doing yourselves or trying to do, with some levels of success. But this is really where all the work is. And it may look simple in the diagram, but it's really not that easy. So it's really routinely extracting data from multiple client systems. Again, these may be core HR, they may be productivity related systems, operations, finance, and really doing it in a secure manner and putting it in a data lake or a staging model that you can then begin to clean and reclassify. We're going to walk through these steps in more detail. We'll talk about the concept of effective dating. And it's also in this area where you might think about forecasting and predicting, but ultimately you're going to go through the process of really quantifying facts that are going to help, in this case, shine light on the employee experience. And these may be facts like terminations and separations and the reasons why. It may be facts about tenure, facts about performance and productivity, looking at absenteeism, looking at engagement through perhaps survey instruments that are being administered across the organization, and then presenting this in an experience so that your users can actually discover and use those insights to answer the questions about improving the employee experience. So that middle piece, that transform, let me break that up, or break that down in a little more detail. So you may have heard of this concept called ETL, which stands for extract, transform, and load. And that pipeline is essentially depicting that on each end from left to middle to right, extract, transform, and load into a series of facts. But that middle piece, that transformation, this is what clients really find difficult doing themselves. So, being able to change the structure and the format of the data as it's coming out of those data sources. HR data is manually entered, for the most part. So there's discrepancies, there's, dirty data, so to speak. But you can't let that stop you from moving forward. You have to work with the data, what you have. You have to expose the data so that you can identify where there might be integrity issues And it's a culture change as well. To move to this data-driven culture, you've got to kind of lower your vulnerability shield and or allow yourself to be vulnerable to the fact that, hey, yeah, our data is dirty, but let's shine the light on it so we can clean it up. So what are some of the transformations? So you might have data encoded. A simple example is gender. It's an M or it's an F, but you want to show it as male or female. You might have somebody's age, but to be able to analyze something, at every age across the boundary, it's better done by binning, right? And age is just an example. It could be tenure, it could be time to hire. So being able to bin that in a series of ranges helps you look at things in a broader swath and broader group, so you can see trends and patterns. We talked, I mentioned briefly about cleaning the data, ensuring the appropriate data types. That dates are dates, integers are integers. Some of the data may come over missing, so it may have to be backfilled. Perhaps there's some if this, then do that, or if this, label it as that. So there's different, again, ways of helping to clean up that data and reinforce the integrity checking, so that ultimately you can bring those different data sets together, whether it's applicant tracking and core HR, whether it's payroll and HR, payroll and performance and productivity and so on. Then you have to think about, as that process is taking place, do we need to start partitioning this data out? How much data do we have? When you get into accessing data, the more data you have, the more horsepower you need to get to that data. So there's more cycles it takes to go through 20 million rows of data than to go through 2 million rows. So you have to think about partitioning and perhaps even merging data sets. And then as we organize the data, as it comes out of those systems, as it comes out of Workday, or it comes out of Ultimate or ZeroedIn, or whatever that is, ADP Workforce Now, you're still going to have to transform and quantify various insights that ultimately are going to be important to you. And these are things like, how much time is occurring between perhaps when somebody moves from a resume submitted status to a phone screening status or a resume review status. How much, what amount is changing when somebody has a pay increase, right? Is it, the fact that it's, $2.50 increase may not be as important as the fact that that's a 20% increase, right? So looking at it in a variety of ways, we have to organize the data. We have to apply certain computations, again, to get it in the right format that's going to be meaningful down the road. We're also going to talk about this concept of kind of date sequencing. And we like to call this effective dating. As you're well aware, in your HR system, you can effective date transactions, right? So Sally gets a pay raise, right? She gets that $2.40 pay raise, and that pay raise is going to get entered today, May 18th, but it's going to be effective either sometime in the past or perhaps sometime in the future. So there's an effective date. So being able to properly manage that over time, and it's not just one date, it's a series of dates, a series of transactions that are taking place, whether it's a pay change, a promotion, a lateral move. You can imagine how many different changes take place in your HR system. That data is ultimately time-stamped within the HR system, but it's not easy to get out in a time-stamped format. But if you can't get it out in the timestamps, you're not going to get the trends and the patterns over time so you can see change. So it's a really important concept. And, again, there's tools to do this, there's concepts to do it, and there's vendors, like ZeroedIn that really can help do this in a way that is going to drive the trends to help back the decisions you're trying to make. Okay, so that's the data pipeline itself. Let's do a quick poll again. When you think about your data pipeline, and what you might be trying to do within your organization to produce the insights, whether it's just to provide facts through your HR business partners to their business counterparts, or whether it is actually measuring the employee experience so that you can drive change. What are some of those weak points? So if we can, if you'd respond to this poll in the right-hand pane, is it aggregating all that disparate data? Is it getting to the historical data and merging it? Are you concerned about your data integrity? Perhaps it's the effective dating. And then once we get beyond the data pipeline and where we're moving next is this concept of taking that data pipeline to build the metrics and insights. So let's see if we've got some responses to the poll here. So not surprised that based on all those different number of data sources from our last poll, that aggregating all that disparate data is a challenge. The last one was pretty interesting. It was, scroll up a little bit. It was we don't have any weak points. We got this, right? Well, it looks like everybody has a little bit of challenge. So, well, that's great. I appreciate you responding to the poll. So the aggregating of the data seems to be, one of the top areas or the weakest points in the pipeline. So let's go ahead and come back to the presentation deck. So let's talk about some of the best practices for developing your metrics and your insights, and then we'll actually expose some of these metrics and insights to you as well that we find important, our clients find important when really managing the employee experience overall and specifically the employee experience. So let's talk about some of those best practices. The first one, and we have to point kind of back to where we started, where do we begin, is it's understanding the data and the questions you're trying to answer, right? If you can frame those in the right way, you're going to, again, determine what those data sources are. And then obviously we have to build that data pipeline. We don't want to recreate the wheel every month, every quarter when we go through an initiative. We have a client, Dollar Tree Family Dollar, that shared on one of our last HCI webinars, actually. Steve Terry, their VP of Total Rewards, shared that they were previously producing a diversity, equity, inclusion report that was taking between 39 to 40 hours every time they had to produce it on a quarterly basis. And once they were able to partner with ZeroedIn, automate their data pipeline, visualize their metrics, and produce the output, the insights that they wanted to share or needed to share with their board and leadership, that process took less than an hour. So being able to recreate that routinely is really valuable. It can be monetized. So then we're going to talk more about formulating those metrics and quantifying the facts. These are, once you get that data organized, this is what you have to think about. What are we going to be counting? What are we going to be averaging? Are we going to be counting employee headcount? Are we going to be averaging time spent in certain states through the recruiting process? So we're going to quantify our facts. But then in order to build confidence in your results, you have to test and validate your findings. So this is really important, because if you do put the data out there, and you should, right, it's going to drive questions. And this is kind of where that vulnerability shield needs to be dropped. But you have to be prepared to answer the questions and help your user community understand what's going into the calculations, where the data is coming from, why it might not be currently as clean as it could be. So building confidence in that data is done through testing and validating the facts that you're looking to quantify. And then ultimately, as you put that into the hands of your users, you want to be able to explain the results to them and really remove the guesswork, right? You don't want to you don't want to just give your users an Excel spreadsheet of data where they have to do their own analysis. They have to, really hunt for what they're looking for. So if there's a way to pre-analyze that and spell it out for them, that's really the best approach. And we'll talk about some techniques to do this. Okay. So quantifying the facts. All right. So everything really starts with headcount. It sounds simple, but it's one of the most challenging metrics that organizations have to get their arms around, because headcount comes in different flavors. There's beginning of period end headcount, ending of period headcount. There's total headcount across the period, which may be higher than the beginning and the ending, which means you've got high volumes of turnover. There's average headcount. There's average daily headcount, which is really a representation of how, the percentage of time an employee is actually in an active state during a particular period of time. Once you can get your arms around headcount, all of the characteristics associated with your people come into play. And these are things like there's both employer and employee characteristics, or the demographics. And these are things like your organization hierarchies. These are your jobs and positions and job families and EEOC codes. These are the employee demographics, right? Things like their gender, their ethnicity, their age, which all provides meaningful statistics and insights as it relates to areas like diversity. But also, as we think about the employee experience, we have to think about movements, right? About the promotions, the demotions, the laterals, the org changes, position changes. These things happen over time, which is where effective dating comes into play. And just counting the fact that somebody has a promotion is important, but how much time is happening between the last promotion, right? How many days? That's equally as important. Many of those movements, such as separations in conjunction with headcount, produce turnover, right? And there's different types of turnover. There's voluntary, there's involuntary, and there's reasons behind that can be codified and analyzed as a result of extracting this from your HR system. And then we can look at turnover, as a snapshot. We can look at it as a rolling 3 month, 6 month, 12-month period over time, which gives better trending and better insights into, is this, into the patterns that are happening. From a hiring perspective, applicant tracking, we want to look at internal and external hires. We want to look at time to hire from a recruiting perspective. We want to look at the number of open recs in relation to the number of candidates or applicants against those requisitions. And then ultimately, we want to identify the sources and, even more importantly, quality of hire, which is really a composite index of various factors. So then we get into payroll and compensation, another key area that drives the employee experience, right? People don't work for free. And they don't want to be overworked, right? So, quality of life, work-life balance is important. So labor hours, how much time they're taking off, sick leave, all of that comes into play from an analysis standpoint. And then it just keeps going. There's tenure, there's engagement from your survey systems, there's learning and development activities, there's recognition. So we go deeper into the employee experience itself. And I'll echo some of the areas that Wendy Walker mentioned in her opening presentation. Looking at the onboarding activity, looking at the confidence factors coming out of it onboarding. Do they have the resources and accessibility to those resources? Is management interacting with them, whether that's through coaching or otherwise? Looking at all the engagement factors that you monitor and look to qualify in your surveys, which also provide insights to your to the culture you're trying to present and sustain within your organization. Looking at your benefits, looking at wellness, looking at career opportunities. I spoke about recognition earlier. This is an important factor. The review and feedback, pay equity. So again, looking at these various factors are really key in helping to quantify facts that will provide insight. And these are valuable independently, but when you can compare and contrast them over common scales, over common timeframes, over common characteristics, those demographics of the workforce, right? Like different parts of the organization, different job roles, different shifts, right? If you're multiple first shift, second shift, third shift type of work. So being able to compare and contrast, turnover in relation to, onboarding confidence is pretty important. All right, so moving beyond the data pipeline, moving beyond quantifying these facts and insights, how do we get them into the hands of your employees, your leaders, your people managers, so that they can use them to enhance the employee experience? Well, it really starts with providing the experience, providing dashboards that target user groups, help to personalize, allow that discovery, so that it's very evidence-based, it's fact-based. So being able to do this in a role-based way and targeting what's important to a particular group of users is very important. Sometimes the data can't stand on its own. So we at ZeroedIn, we use a concept called data rooms that really provide the ability to annotate notes, whether that's analyst guidance from your HR analysis team, or whether it's your vendor partner that's helping to contribute and analyze, to really use the text and the context to help tell a story with the data. Because again, datas and visuals can't always stand on their own. Being able to integrate surveys, that qualitative data, engagement is a good measure as it relates to employee experience. But you have to capture and analyze and bring that in so that it's an integral part of analysis with other quantifiable facts. Being able to measure your strategies. So when you identify that work-life balance is a challenge, how do you measure? How do you take action on that? Well, perhaps there's a way of implementing scorecards that allow you to build a strategic plan around driving workforce balance activities. Maybe there's certain campaigns, take time to unwind, or whatever that is, that need to be managed and monitored and measured for its success. There's also the whole concept of predicting. So looking at all these different facts and using that to predict the future and actually prescribe what might be happening and what the organization can do to change what might happen in the future. That's where analytics really takes us. And, as an organization, you have to think about, if you put the dashboards out there, if you tell a story with the data, if you're integrating your survey or you have your scorecards or predictions, is that enough? Will your users really understand it? Well, we like to play this concept of this. We'll talk about that in what we call the analytics concierge. So just back up here. So being able to provide an analytics concierge that really helps the organization understand the data is, you have to think about how you might enable that. So in wrapping this up on the sharing piece, take a hard look. Not everyone needs access to all the data. You can apply certain filters that maybe just give them their business unit, just the roles that are important to them or their department. You can actually provide context in a way that it tells a story. If you're putting charts out there, write your graph titles as if they're headline. Some solutions can do pre-analysis and actually title those charts for you. But ultimately, telling the story is going to provide the best context that helps explain the results to your user community. And you just can't give them the data. You have to really provide a service as an HR organization. And you're doing this in other parts, right? You're doing this through your HR business partner program, but you have to do it with your data as well. Whether that's providing, additional data science services, providing that analyst guidance, helping them monitor, understand, incorporating benchmarks. Everyone wants to compare where they are against their peers, their other departments, their competitors, and really holding their hands in what, we at ZeroedIn, we like to call a white glove service. But it's going beyond just the data and helping organizations get their most value from their analytics so that they can ultimately drive and improve the employee experience. So a couple resources you'll have available in the deck, which you can download if you're interested about ZeroedIn. We have our contact information, and I'll be doing a Q&A and a data session right after this, right, Bill?
That's correct.
Okay.